Hey guys, we are going to recap a movie called King of New York. Keep watching because it's a great crime movie. The film opens with a man named Frank White, one of the biggest mafia bosses in New York City. We see him getting out of prison after serving 14 years for drug trafficking. He controlled the entire drug trade and no one could distribute drugs without his orders. But when he got out of prison, he discovered that his power and control were no longer what they were, as the drug trade was now under the control of mafia leaders from China and Colombia. He also discovered that they had eliminated his partners, who had previously worked with him. Elsewhere, we see a Colombian mafia leader named Emilio, while he is outside trying to call via a public phone. But suddenly, a gang attacks him and kills him. One of the gang members shows him a picture of the news of Frank's release. At the same time, we see a person named Jimmy agreeing on a drug deal with a Colombian mafia leader named King Tito. Jimmy was doubting the quality of the goods that Tito had in order to lower the price of the deal, but Tito was annoyed by this talk and decided to raise the price of the deal to 10%. He told him that the quality of his goods is very pure and no one offers this quality. Jimmy tries to take the deal at the same previous price, but Tito was insisting on the new price, and this is because Tito knew that Jimmy had problems with most drug dealers and could not buy from them. Jimmy is forced to agree to the deal. Then he brings the bag of money. When Tito opened the bag, he discovered that it was filled with small cotton bags. Then suddenly, Jimmy takes out the weapon and eliminates Tito and his men. We discover that Jimmy is the person responsible for Emilio's murder. Then Jimmy and his men steal Tito's money and merchandise and go to Frank. Jimmy welcomes Frank and he is happy to be released from prison. He tells him that they got rid of Emilio and Tito and seized their money and goods. Then Frank goes to a party specially prepared for him due to his release from prison. He is received by very well-known people and senior people in the country because they previously worked with him. Frank goes and sits with his lawyer, Jennifer, and his special assistant, Dalicio. Frank asks Dalicio to go to a gang leader named Gilly to tell him that Frank wants to meet him about work. But Dalicio tells him that Gilly is an arrogant person and does not think he will agree. Frank orders him to carry out his request because he wants to return to the drug trade and wants to control the city. Dalicio actually goes to Gilly. He tells him that Frank wants to meet him, but he strongly refuses because he knows that Frank has a connection to the killing of Colombian mafia leaders. And this made him lose a lot of money because he was cooperating with them in the drug trade. Dalicio tries to convince him again to meet Frank, and they reach an agreement, but Gilly gets angry and expels him from the place. On the same day, Frank was with Jennifer on the subway when suddenly a group of armed men attacked them and asked Frank to hand over everything he owned. They took Jennifer's bag, but he showed them his gun, which made them afraid and run away. Before they left, he called them, gave them some money, and asked them to come to him later because he wanted them to work with him. After Dalicio told him what happened with Gilly, Frank himself went to Gilly. Frank tells him that he will participate in any deal that happens in the city, but Gilly refuses and tells him that he will not allow him to participate in his business. Suddenly, Frank takes out his gun and kills Gilly. He offered Gilly's men to join him, and they agreed to do so. The next day, Frank and Jennifer went to attend a special screening of a movie at the cinema. There, he met the mayor of the city, Edward, and he asked him why the construction of the hospital in the neighborhood was not completed. Edward told him that the budget would not allow him to complete the construction of the hospital, especially since the budget for building the hospital was very huge. But Frank told him that it was strange that a city with a population of 20 million people did not have a budget to build a hospital. Edward told him that if he wanted the hospital to be completed, he would have to finance it himself. He told him that the hospital needs $16 million in the next 3 months. Edward was intentionally saying that in order to challenge Frank, but contrary to what was expected, Frank agreed and told him that he would bring him money. After that, Frank tells his lawyer Abraham that the construction of this hospital must be completed and that he will get the money in his own way. But Abraham advises him to stay away from anything that might put him back in prison. After that, 3 police investigators, Roy, Thomas and Dennis, come and arrest Frank. Abraham tries to intervene and stop them, but they ignore him. Then they arrived at a deserted place and took Frank out of the car. They opened the trunk of the car and there was an injured person named Enrico. Roy asks Frank about his relationship with this person. He also accused him of being the one who did this to him. We discover that Enrico is the leader of a Colombian drug trafficking gang, but Frank denies knowing him and does not know who did this to him. The investigators are angry because they know that Frank was the one who got rid of the Mafia leaders, but they have no evidence against him. Roy tells him that they will continue to monitor him until they return him to prison again. After that, D'Alessio goes to meet a Chinese Mafia leader at the cinema in order to agree with him on a drug deal. But the Chinese Mafia leader sets a condition that he must take the money from the deal in cash. D'Alessio knew that Frank did not have all the money, so he offered to give him half the money upon receipt and the other half after the sale. But the Chinese Mafia leader refused and asked D'Alessio to tell Frank that he has many men and is ready for anything. D'Alessio suggested that he sit down with Frank to agree, and the Chinese Mafia leader actually agreed to that. The next day, Jimmy goes to buy food, but suddenly, the police arrive and arrest him on charges of killing Colombian people because Enrico confessed against him. Frank meets the Chinese Mafia leader. Frank told him that the price of his goods was very high and that he would not be able to profit from this deal, so he suggested that his men sell the goods and share the profits together. But the Chinese Mafia leader refused that and told him that there were many merchants interested in his goods. He was insisting on taking his money in cash. After that, Frank discovers that Jimmy has been arrested. Jennifer tells him that Enrique was the one who confessed against him. Frank asked her if they could get him out on bail. She told him that they could get him out on bail of $1 million, and she also told him that if they paid the full amount, this would cause them more problems. But Frank was not interested and asked her to take Jimmy out. She actually goes and pays bail and gets Jimmy out of prison. The three investigators arrive and they are angry about Jimmy's release from prison. Jennifer tells them that if they try to harass Jimmy in any way, she will file a lawsuit against them. At night, Frank's men arrive at Chinatown, where the Chinese Mafia leader is located. A fierce gun battle takes place, but Frank's men manage to eliminate them. Frank and Jimmy reach the Chinese Mafia leader and get rid of him. Then they take his money and drugs. After that, we see a celebration marking the completion of the construction of the neighborhood hospital after Frank paid the money in full. Newspapers and news reported this news. The three investigators were watching the news and were very angry. Dennis suggests that they form a gang and attack Frank, but Roy refuses and warns him against this plan. We then watch Frank's men having a party and having a good time. D'Alessio arrives with a drug dealer from Los Angeles to buy the Chinese Mafia leader's drugs that Frank has seized. But the drug dealer tells Frank that the amount is very large and that he will only be able to pay half the amount and the other half after the sale. But Frank was determined to take all the money. The man agreed to that, but on the condition that he see the drugs himself. He goes with D'Alessio. When he goes out the door, he kills the guard. We discover that D'Alessio betrayed Frank and collaborated with the drug dealer. A gang attacks Frank's headquarters, and a strong battle takes place between them. The gang was able to take control of the place, and Frank escapes from the place with Jimmy. Jimmy is surprised that one of the gang members is holding the car door. He tries to push him away and removes the mask on his face, and he discovers that this person is a police officer. We discover that Dennis carried out the plan and formed a gang led by policemen in order to eliminate Frank. Jimmy was able to get rid of the policemen. The police continue to chase them and shoot at them, but Jimmy confronts them and shoots them as well. Frank manages to get rid of one of the cars. Dennis and Thomas chase Frank until they reach a car garage. Suddenly Frank appears and hits them hard with his car. Then Jimmy and Frank escape from the place. Thomas continues to chase them and manages to reach Jimmy. A fight occurs between them, and Jimmy manages to shoot him. Dennis arrives and shoots Jimmy and kills him. He then tries to save Thomas, but it is too late because Thomas is dead. The next day at Thomas's funeral, Dennis decides to take revenge on Frank. But while he was riding in the car, another car came with Frank in it, and he killed Dennis. Frank returns to headquarters and speaks with D'Alessio after his men manage to capture him. Frank asks him why he betrayed him. He tells him that he did it for money and that the police recruited him after they arrested Enrico. Frank got angry and asked his men to kill him. After Roy returned from work, he was surprised by the presence of Frank in front of him. Frank spoke to him and confessed to him that he was the one who killed Gilly. He told him about the crimes that the Colombian and Chinese Mafia men were committing in order to justify why he killed them. Roy gets angry and tells him that he is not a judge to judge people. But Frank tells him that there are difficult decisions for the judge to make and that there must be quick rulings. Roy tells him that he knows that he got rid of the Colombian and Chinese Mafia leaders in order to control the drug trade in the city. Frank told him that even if he was caught, the drug trade would still exist and that it would be better for him to run it himself. Then he takes Roy's gun and forces him to handcuff himself. Then Roy manages to free himself and chases Frank. He finds him in the subway, but Frank takes a woman hostage and asks Roy to drop his gun. Roy tries to tell him that this woman is not at fault and asks him to leave her. Indeed, he leaves her, but he shoots Roy and leaves. Then he got into a taxi. The driver was worried about Frank because he noticed that he was injured and bleeding. We discover that Roy shot Frank in the stomach. When the driver saw the gun with Frank, he quickly got out of the car and told the police. The car is surrounded by the police, but Frank bled a lot of blood and died before he could be arrested.